My favorite news source is an Instagram account. It's called Your Only Source of Serotonin. And it's just kind of happy, funny things, specifically that have to do with animals. So I think that's my news consumption for most of my life.
Well, I subscribed to The Onion recently. Like when they tried to buy InfoWars, I was like, man, I'm giving these guys $50 or whatever it was for a year. And so like I get a print edition of The Onion and read that. And like, that makes me feel better.
I didn't even know they did that. Incredible.
Oh, it's so good. Yeah, just sparks joy.
Welcome back to the Commerce Collective podcast brought to you by Flywheel. You're listening to This Month Above the Fold, a monthly series on the Commerce Collective feed where Patrick Miller, co-founder of Flywheel, and I cover the most important commerce topics each month, and this is your May 2025 episode. I'm Emma Irwin, brand marketing manager at Flywheel and host of this podcast. Today, we are talking about Flywheel's recently launched Consumer Long-Term Value Dashboard, and then we're going to cover some key points from two recently published reports from both LUMA and Ben Evans, looking at everything from AI to Meta's renaissance to determinism versus probabilism and more. That's a lot, so let's get right into it.
All right, today we're going to hit on our own launch of our CLTV dashboard, and then we're going to dig into some of those reports that have come out recently. We have the LUMA State of Digital 2025 report. We'll touch on the Ben Evans report if we've got interesting things to say at the end, just talking about things that are happening. So kicking us off with our very own CLTV dashboard, which is essentially an easy way for advertisers to visualize consumer behavior over time. And now my voice is dying. We're back. We've talked about the importance of long-term value for what feels like a very long time now, but now our clients and our own teams can actually see these insights in a really digestible, accessible way. There are multiple reports looking at different elements of LTV. But now I'm curious to ask you, because we actually have dashboards that visualize this, that people can access. How are we actually, without giving away the secret sauce, calculating LTV? I've been trying to wrap my head around this in terms of like, are we looking at total dollar value per customer? Are we predicting a number? What time frame are we looking at? Because my true long-term value, we won't know that until I'm dead. And so I'm wondering, well, how are we thinking about that?
Sure. So number one, it depends. Well, every brand's different. And so like a laundry detergent brand is going to think about LTV at a different time horizon than a big screen TV company, than a mattress company. And so what we wanted to do is provide the flexibility to brands to think about it, how they want it and think through their repeat. But also on a repeat level, some brands might only have 5 SKUs. Other brands have tens of thousands. And some brands think of themselves as, hey, I just have one brand. And some brands have multiple brands. And so we want to give brands the sort of the opportunity to look at it, however they want. And so do they want to look at just one SKU and how much value a customer will create every year? Or do they want to look at across an entire brand and look how much value a customer creates over multiple years? Or even more interesting, if I am a house of brands, how much revenue, does a customer drive for me, over multiple years? And so we wanted to create something that, without being overly complex, gives brands ultimately the flexibility to sort of acknowledge the uniqueness of each brand in each category, so it can be customized to each of them.
If I'm a mattress brand, I only sell mattresses. Is there any value in these dashboards for a brand like that, where the repeat purchase is kind of like 8 years?
Yeah. So number one, my expectation is that every year that elapses, Amazon, is not going to create a rolling 5-year window. They're going to keep adding to it. And so eventually you'll get to 10 years and then you can look at mattresses. But most companies, including mattress companies, expand out. And so they start saying, hey, I'm going to make a pillow, or I'm going to make sheets, or I'm going to make a dog bed, or what have you. And so that then allows brands to look at sort of the power of their brands as they're able to then expand the basket to customers. And so I buy a Casper mattress, I really like it, great branding, and I buy my dog a Casper mattress bed. And then so I can start seeing sort of how I'm able to then expand it. And so I like to think of it as sort of as asynchronous basket building. And so you're able to see sort of the value of individual customers, over time, and then create cohorts to figure out, how do you, find more customers like that who may not just be willing to buy your mattress, but also your mattress plus your dog mattress. And so you can then see, sort of how to then expand that to drive additional revenue for your brand.
And I think you've now led into my next question, which is we're kind of aggregating these shoppers into cohorts, which makes it kind of easy to take a bunch of people who made a purchase within the same window of time and then find more like them, which I know is AMC audiences. You use those to go find more like them. But can you elaborate a little bit more on that? Just because I think that's helpful for people who look at the dashboard and they're like, okay, great. And I know I need to use AMC audiences, But how? Now what?
So a couple different vectors you can go. So one, you could say, hey, which ASIN is point of market entry? And then how do I then advertise that ASIN more widely to pull more people in? But then I can also look at sort of what are my downstream ASINs. So customer buys my point of market entry ASIN, then they buy the downstream. And then so what are sort of the if-thens and sort of how do I create a logic or a probabilistic audience on top of that, to then pull them in to allow that cross-sell and that async basket. And then also across all of these, there is then the ability to then deploy it not just on streaming television, but across sponsored products as well. And so by using sort of the bid multipliers there, it allows sponsored products to reach customers that are more valuable to a brand than necessarily just going off the targeting expression, i.e. the keyword. And so to me, that's a really big unlock because it allows brands to start thinking beyond ROAS and start thinking about sort of what is that longer term value, of each individual customer.
Just getting into all my questions before I even get
I'm trying to lead you in the right direction.
Thanks. Okay. Before we get into shifting away from ROAS, I am kind of curious. So obviously this is an Amazon focused dashboard because it's using AMC Insights. What about calculating LTV for brands in which you don't have this information? Is this Excel math that you then have to do? Do we just look towards the future of hoping that other retailers eventually allow kind of access to insights such as those?
I mean, I think first it depends, does the retailer have the ability to actually measure this? And so what does their identity graph look like? And so somebody, like Costco has perfect identity because every person who walks in there, uses the card. And so, we're excited about the partnership with Costco and YouTube that was announced recently because in my mind, it's going to allow brands to sort of invest in sort of the upper funnel and then see what happens, sort of transactionally over time at Costco. For other retailers, it's a little bit trickier because they don't necessarily have that identity graph or they have a portion of that identity graph. And so there is some inference that has to be done. But in my mind, it's sort of, if I look at sort of the AMC audiences and sort of LTV over time, and then I compare that with, sort of panel data, I can get a pretty good snapshot across various retailers to make some assumptions. It's not perfect, but it's better than sort of anything else that's out there.
Got it. Okay. Shifting away from ROAS and to return on, or you didn't use return on consumer, but that's what we're calling it, return on consumer and the longer term value of what consumers drive for you over time. Why is that where we're headed? You made the connection of this is where we're headed, but why?
ROAS is it's just awful math. It's simplistic at best, and especially for enterprise brands where they're dealing with channel shifting. And so this is a game of unit economics, and it's a game of unit economics on each individual, sort of SKU out the door, and sort of what are those economics for, hey, how heavy is it? What's the mass? What's the ASP? What's the PPU? And then, what does it cost, to get to the customer? And then you then multiply that over time. And so, but and you can figure out sort of what is the value of that ASIN over time to the retailer and to the brand. The inverse is also true in the sense that what is the value of the individual customer? And so, what does it cost to acquire that customer? What does it cost to sort of build a relationship with that customer, get them to repeat, cross-sell, upsell, et cetera. And so we want to help sort of bridge, between the unit economics of an ASIN to the unit economics of a customer, and then help brands sort of shift that to show, look, this is ultimately sort of a game of, how many people do you reach? What happens to those people that you do reach? And then how much value do they create over time? And so we think that is a way to sort of, math this out in an elegant way that bridges beyond just short-term ROAS.
Gotcha. I'll save for another episode so that we have something new to talk about when a lot of our data science friend who talks a lot about, okay, how do we measure everything that leads up to that first purchase and put that into return on consumer as well?
Exactly. It's a verticalization. I think a lot of people are trying to figure out hey, what's my reach and frequency, sort of across walled gardens. And they're never going to hand back one-to-one information. So stop, the best you can do is, I guess. And quite frankly, I don't care because if I can prove the return over time verticalized on the retailer, it's a moot point. And so quite frankly, I'd rather over frequency than under frequency because I ultimately want to make sure that I drive the outcome I'm looking for. And so as I look to the future, I see it sort of verticalized on top of the retailers where the upper funnel and the pubs sit on top, but ultimately you're measuring efficacy down to the retailer level, which is then tied back to the individual customer and then how much value they create.
I'm popping in here to bring you this week's Retail Insights Briefing. Each year, the Flywheel Retail Insights team produces an annual report that we call Future Retail Disruption, highlighting the forces reshaping retail and revealing the strategies that brands and retailers must adopt to stay ahead. We just published the latest version, and our team has spotlighted 9 key shifts that the industry should be organizing around. It includes topics that you hear us talk about a lot, like retail media evolution and data clean rooms, but also how retailer business models and ecosystems are getting more complex and will require brands to approach customer partnerships differently in the future. Not only that, this report also talks about how shopper behaviors and economic changes will affect consumption patterns. We share how technologies like AI and autonomous vehicles will have a lasting impact on the industry. We predict which channels and retailers are the future winners. And yes, we, of course, touch on tariffs. Our clients use this report as a tentpole in their planning process for 2026 and beyond. If you're a subscriber to Flywheel's Retail Insights platform, the full report is available now. If you are not, you can join us later this month when our team hosts a virtual webinar sharing highlights of the research. Of course, the registration link is in the show notes, so head right there, you can click on it, register, come and join us for the fun. And that's it for this month's Retail Insights briefing. Back to me.
Whoop, whoop. Okay, moving on to LUMA put out a State of Digital report for 2025 recently. I'm a big fan of this report. I like how they have the visualizations make a lot of sense, and then every slide has like the speaker notes in it so that I actually know what the chart is trying to tell me. And I very much appreciate this as someone who doesn't get to like watch a presentation of it go live. But essentially, this report is covering a bunch of different shifts. A lot of the themes are very similar to what we've been talking about. That's crazy. At least we're in alignment with some other people. But one of these mentioned shifts, or it's like maybe even a string of shifts, is towards outcomes-based marketing. And obviously, we've talked a bunch about that with determinism. And then that's powered by commerce data. But for real impact, channels like mobile, commerce media, CTV, and all of the different gardens have to actually be able to talk to each other. And of all of that, does anything, vague question, but does anything stand out most significantly to you in that kind of string of shifts or from the report itself?
I mean, we were right.
Yeah.
We were right. I mean, and so our dogmatic focus on outcomes and driving, ultimately the outcome we care the most about is sales, it's affirming. And so very much agree with that one and want to keep, pushing on that. I thought it sort of hinted at second order effects of, what happens if Google's ad tech business is spun off, which I don't think the open web is necessarily acknowledging yet. Like right now, Google has like a huge incentive to send traffic to the open web because they then monetize the second time via their DSP. If their DSP is cleaved off, they no longer have that incentive. And so it's sort of like, why not just monetize it via text links and in AI summaries? And so I thought that was a good point that they made. I don't think is necessarily, it's a little bit of be careful what you ask for. As far as the Google, ad tech spinoff or, whatever the feds do there. I think that, sort of acknowledging that there is no greater monetization strategy than ads. And certainly that's where it seems that, certainly driven by OpenAI's recent, hiring, that's where it is going, and the fact that Google, this wasn't in the deck, but Google's already said that they're not seeing a drop off as far as yield when they're using AI summaries versus, just sort of blue links in ads. And so, it's sort of like, the ads are, and I think this is the thing that the brands are all challenged with. It's like, okay, well, how do I influence, the AI bot? And, what are those things that, that go into, the training set? And in many ways, it reminds me of like, sort of like, hey, how do I influence the SERP? And sort of what are those inputs? And so a lot of it comes back down to sort of like, well, what's the catalog? What's all the metadata behind individual SKUs? And then how are these things ranking? And sort of they touch upon that. That's interesting. Disagree with them on sort of like they're sort of dogmatic about probabilistic measurement. Like I look at it more as an and statement. It is deterministic and probabilistic measurement. You get the determinism right at a smaller scale. You then bridge to the probabilism, but you have to have the foundation of the determinism right. They don't hit on targeting. Targeting, I think, right now is mostly deterministic. It will become more probabilistic, especially through lookalikes and clean rooms and trusted encrypted environments. We'll see how long that all takes to roll out. But there's sort of this idea that probabilism is like the perfect solve, while also saying, hey, I'm focused on outcomes, a little bit at odds with one another. Like I want to focus on the determinism and the outcomes first, and then bridge to the probabilism at a greater scale. But like you can't do the latter before you do the former.
Well, it wouldn't be fun if we agreed with them on everything. Well,
no. But it's good. Yeah, and they also have a really good point about sort of like AI as like the next AWS in the sense that like you allow a startup to scale more quickly, with fewer people. In the same way that AWS has enabled that for the past 20 years or so, AI accelerates that even more. And seeing that with a couple of companies I advise, where it's like small teams are able to get a ton of throughput real quick, and so that sort of gets sort of 0 to 1 a lot faster, which becomes interesting for these various startups and how they can create value. It then becomes sort of like, if that is then true, you're then going to have more startups that are out there. You then sort of have smaller teams that are fighting, which then creates an interesting sort of opportunity for PE to then like, what sectors do they roll up quickly? And then where is the sort of the value? And I think an unacknowledged value that's out there is like, who has the deterministic checks on the probabilism to solve for that across these, because there is these limits, within the LLMs around the probabilism and how they sort of spit out results, which is, I think, a point that Ben Evans makes, very well in his deck.
Man, I was just going to be like, and that's exactly what Ben Evans was saying on this one. And then the vibe coding with the AWS and the Venn diagrams and the LLMs. Oh,
yeah, and also just looking at it over time. And it's one of the reasons I do like Ben Evans, besides, his great British accent. He takes a longer view, than most folks, and he's just pithy enough. I think he would take both as a compliment, but he's not reporting on the news necessarily what happened yesterday. It's not a game of hot takes. It's a more patient look. And so one of the things I think he points out very well in the deck is, across the various, LLMs, like, well, who's building a consumer brand? Who's building a B2B brand? What do they want to happen? And it's very clear that based off of, how much press, Sam Altman does, and as evidenced by OpenAI being a top of the App Store charts, forever and ever, it's like they are very focused on creating a consumer brand. And then that's in tension with Microsoft, with Google, with Meta, with Apple, who are all trying to featureize what OpenAI and the other LLMs can do. And if the LLMs are indistinguishable, from one another, well, that to me creates a opportunity for the incumbents. But if they're able to build a consumer brand and then build the things on top, maybe they can then break free. And that's why, like, sort of they're investing in all the Apple designers and pulling them in to see if they can create a product, which then leapfrog sort of being gatekept from Google or Apple via the devices. So sort of see where that lands. But I think it's interesting, sort of, across that space and sort of where do they go, especially that, the models are, basically the same. And so, it's like, and as you even look at like everything that we're doing with AI, like, it's like and I know we're not unique in this, and everybody's building it so they're easily hot swappable, or it's easy for folks to pick what they want to use. And so it's like, okay, well, where are the moats? And maybe creating a consumer brand is the ultimate moat here.
Okay. I am curious. I'd say like the back third of this LUMA report covers a lot about kind of where people are consuming media and trying to connect the dots between social, I believe it's commerce data, and CTV. But you sent me on a journey of listening to a very long podcast episode about Meta's Renaissance, in which I did do this, and it was a great challenge.
Great podcast, isn't it?
It was fantastic. I just have not listened to something for that long in so long. I've become just like brain numb. And I was like, okay, Emma, you have to listen. You have to listen to the words. You can't be writing as well.
Uh-huh.
But I'm curious. In LUMA's report, they showcase how much ad spend goes to Meta, and that makes sense. Like, Meta obviously drives things for brands, but in this podcast, he argues it's still like all of their advertising enhancements are kind of black box still. And so now I'm going to tie us back to outcomes-based marketing. Like, do you think that ad spend will still be so significant for Meta when it is kind of a black box for advertisers?
There's only two vectors that matter in advertising. There is time and there is signal. And Meta has tons and tons and tons of time. And so if people are spending time on it, it's a matter of them figuring out, how do they monetize it and give brands trust that they are driving that spend. What ATT did to Meta, and this is the Mobile Dev Memo podcast, which I highly recommend. It's also worth subscribing to. Sort of how ATT forced them to rebuild, sort of their ad tech and create sort of an interesting way of classifying video, which we've also seen. A friend of ours, Mark Menino, is now over at VidMob, who also has similar technology, which I think is really interesting. But how do you go and figure out, like, I no longer can plug into necessarily to these via Apple's APIs. I now have to do it myself. So how do I classify videos videos by like what are people watching, then use that to create like an interest graph, not necessarily an identity graph, but then also then tie back to the individual websites of when are they transacting. So I can hand that back to see sort of what is the efficacy, which is the other thing that's not acknowledged in the podcast, but I think is actually critical, is the increase of the conversion rate across Shopify over time. So it used to be like just like a couple of points, but it's gone up over time. And I think that's principally because of Apple Pay, because it's so seamless when you go check out, which creates a really strong signal for Meta, to know that everything is working, which is actually kind of funny because Apple's the one who tried to kneecap Meta, but then Apple is now empowering Meta because of the Apple Pay, because conversion rate goes up, which is then stronger signal that Meta is then able to then better monetize via the dwell time on the sites.
Boom. Do you know the memes of the guy with a sign where he's just like standing and holding a sign?
I'm too old for memes.
Fair enough. Okay.
You all share them on Slack, and I like sit in my rocking chair, and I'm like, kids, so much more clever than me.
Well, a lot of things you've said, I feel like very well fit into this guy with a sign type of meme where he just like holds up a sign that says something like very straightforward. It's a little bit controversial. Like someone could come in and be like, oh, but but anyways, I think when
I was your age, Emma.
her.
And that's it for this month's Commerce News. Join us next month for our recap of what happened and what's interesting in commerce, plus insights from our Retail Insights briefing. I'm Emma Irwin, and we'll see you next time.